So I'd like to welcome you all to the first Helen seminar of 2026. Before we begin today, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the unceded Aboriginal lands on which we are joining today. In particular, I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the lands on which Helen and the Melbourne Law School are located. Helen pays its respects to elders, past, present, and recognises past and present and recognises the enduring importance of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. So today we have two talks on the sort of parallels between healthcare and policing. The seminar title is Healthcare and Policing, Different Tools in the Same Toolbox. We have two wonderful speakers for you today. First up, we have Dr. Hannah Maslen, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the UHERO Oxford Institute at the University of Oxford. At the Oxford Institute, she leads the Institute's programming on policing ethics, and she is also the Force Ethics Consultant for Thames Valley Police in the UK. Following Hannah, we have Dr. Matthew Minehan, who is a teacher and researcher who specializes in ethics, evidence-based criminology, and creating misconduct-resistant organizational cultures. He is currently an adjunct senior lecturer at Charles Sturt University's Australian Graduate School of Policing and Security. So thank you very much both. Hannah, I will hand over to you to share your screens and get us started.
Thank you, Chris. So thank you very much for having me, and thank you everybody for joining. So I'm going to talk to you today about policing ethics and principles for guiding decision making in ethical dilemmas in policing. And this work is based on a paper that I've been writing with colleague Colin Payne in the UK and also with Matthew. So credit to them as well for helping shape these ideas. So, as I'm sure you're very aware, policing throws up a lot of high stakes ethical dilemmas every day. Officers and investigators will be having to decide when to use coercive powers, managing risks of serious harm and preventing serious harm, and often under a lot of uncertainty and time pressure. But compared to medicine, policing, at least in the jurisdiction I work from, has a much less settled, shared ethical guidance for resolving conflict, particularly value conflict in practice. And so, given the sort of some similarities with medicine, the high stakes nature, serious, sometimes life and death decision making, we thought it was a natural starting point to look at for whether the principles that are used there could be of use for policing. And principalism itself is attractive for reasons I'll go into in more depth. But our kind of broad claim in this paper is that while the approach is good of principalism, it can't be transplanted wholesale into policing. It needs some re-engineering. So I'm going to do three things today. First, I'll outline the ethically decisive differences between medicine and policing. And then secondly, I'll set out our adapted, what we're catchily calling NJAB plus L, it'll make more sense as I go along, framework, including an elastic hierarchy and a staged way of making trade-offs between competing principles explicit. And then third, hopefully if there's time, I will end with a couple of short worked examples to show you how it behaves in practice. So, just to motivate the idea a bit more, why principalism, why policing ethics? As I said, in day-to-day policing, you see the same ethical considerations recur around preventing harm, respecting rights, acting fairly, promoting longer-term safety, and also maintaining public trust. But when those values collide, much existing guidance, at least in England and Wales, stops at the levels of sort of slogans or very high level aspirations. So, for example, the Code of Ethics in England and Wales for policing outlines core values or perhaps virtues of courage, respect and empathy, and public service. But if you're an officer deciding whether to initiate a high risk pursuit to stop a suspect, for example, you're weighing up the potential criminal justice value of doing so, the deterrence value, the harms both to the person being pursued and to the public who might be in the way of the pursuit and the officers themselves, all of these things. And courage, for example, doesn't really help you adjudicate, quite when this would be ethically permissible and when not. So just also a quick reminder of what I mean by principlism, and you will be very familiar with this, I'm sure, from Beecham and Childress's four principles. In medical ethics, it's most closely aligned with those four principles: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. So I won't go over those again because I know those will be familiar terms to you. And so we're looking at medicine partly because of principlism being attractive and partly because of some similarities. And I think, particularly when it comes to looking at principlism as an approach to resolving ethical dilemmas, it looks promising because it covers a large part of the moral terrain with a small or manageable set of mid-level principles. And because as an approach, it balances pluralism with action guidance. But as I've said, we are going to argue that it needs some re-engineering. The key point for us is the method. So specifying what principles require in the context, and then how to balance them when they pull in different directions. And that combination of shared precise vocabulary and practical procedure is what policing, at least in my interactions with policing in the UK, what it seems to lack when it comes to looking at police ethics and ethical dilemmas. So we're keeping the principlist method and rebuilding the content for policing. So, to move on to some of the differences now between medicine and policing, um, there are several. So, medicine is the moral architecture of medicine is usually consent forward and patient centered. So, autonomy is sometimes flagged as being the first amongst equals with it between the four principles. Whereas policing often involves lawful coercion, authorized by public consent. And so policing often constrains rights as part of what it does. The therapeutic orientation towards the patient is the parallel in policing is that interactions are more sometimes adversarial and involve enforcement. Um, there are, yeah, several differences in the sort of just general context of decision making. I don't want to draw too sharp a distinction on the sort of time frame one because medicine does involve rapid decision making as well. But in the sort of typical case, there's more scope for deliberation and discussion, whereas policing is often very sort of fast time decisions under uncertainty. And then the next 2 points kind of cover the same thing, that there are just more people's interests involved in ethical dilemmas in policing often. Non-maleficence, so if we think of that as avoiding harm or not causing harm, in medicine, it's patient directed. In policing, it's going to be multi-directional. There are considerations relating to the public at large, victims, offenders, the officers themselves. Multiple people's interests are at stake in policing. And then the final big difference is sort of the authority from which decisions are made. In medicine, legitimacy is not a word that is really used because it's not a central concept. In medicine, expertise is relevant and necessary and probably a threshold condition for being somebody's clinician. But in policing, legitimacy is a first order democratic principle that is also very fragile. So trust in police can be easily lost, but public trust is really important for cooperation. But it also has this kind of democratic element of shaping the policing that is done in the public's name. So how would we how would we revise the principles then, given these differences? So this is a sort of first glance. I'll go into some more details in a bit. Autonomy becomes less about consent and more about protecting rights and agency in encounters where consent may not be possible or probably possibly even not required given coercive powers. So this is about the costs of rights interferences, for example, to individuals' privacy, their freedom of movement and association, bodily integrity when it comes to police searches and so on. Non-maleficence becomes multi-directional because the same action can reduce harm for one party while increasing harm or risk for another. And we are going to specify it as a principle that directs the police to avoid causing or allowing immediate specific harm, including from inaction. And obviously, one of the primary goals of the police is to prevent harm from crime. So, in our framework, beneficence, the kind of further benefit elements, becomes about broader, longer-term public safety through more diffuse deterrence and crime prevention effects. And justice in policing has to carry criminal justice aims, so considerations around the value of prosecution and conviction, which obviously police activity supports and aims at. Distributive fairness, the police, as in healthcare, have limited resources, so decisions have to be made about what to prioritize. And procedural fairness, equality of treatment and procedural fairness are really, really important for legitimacy. And then legitimacy becomes a key principle in its own right, because in a democratic setting, coercive authority has to be publicly justifiable, both at the level of the institution of the police service and in its day-to-day exercise. So for shorthand, we can think of this as a democratic value, but I'm going to give it a bit more nuance as we go along. So just to kind of recap for a moment, this is our model in its simplest thought form, and we're already suggesting a hierarchy here, but I will go into that in more detail. We keep principalism as a method because specification and balancing are really useful and part of what's needed. What we change is the content of the principles. And we probably also would change the labels, but for the kind of purpose of the intellectual purpose of mapping them, we're going to keep these labels as we go through. But for a policing, operational policing product, a different gloss would be needed. So we keep the four headings, but we specify them for policing and add legitimacy, which has a fifth element with a special role. And our claim is deliberately modest. We're not trying to promise an ethical calculator. We're offering a disciplined way to make clear which values are in play, which ethical considerations are in play in a particular situation, and to reduce talking past each other and to document trade-offs in a way that can be scrutinized. But we're not just claiming that things should be clearer. In a couple of slides' time, I'm going to defend our default hierarchy, which is grounded in a justification of the general but not fixed relative importance of the principles in policing. So before we get to that and try to make it a bit more concrete, I'm just going to say a couple more things about legitimacy, because this is a novel concept for the sort of principlist approach, at least. And because it gives you a bit more understanding of the weight we're giving it in decision making. And I think it's one of the distinctive parts of our model. So firstly, there's legitimacy provides a kind of initial gate of bounded rightful authority. So some coercive uses of power are going to simply fail that basic test. So in jurisdictions like ours, for example, constant surveillance or stop and search without reasonable grounds for suspicion, even if it were to find more prohibited items, just wouldn't be something that the police should do. It would be an illegitimate use of police power. It would go beyond rightful authority. So you wouldn't even get to the kind of balancing stage there. You wouldn't be thinking, well, to what extent are these rights being interfered with? What benefits might we get from it? Because it's just a no-go. So first of all, in any consideration of whether the police should act in a certain way, this gate sort of has to be passed. But then there's also the aspect of legitimacy that is constituted by doing well on the other principles. So legitimacy is partly constituted by good performance on these. So being fair, respecting rights, minimizing harm, and promoting public welfare and security is essentially the business of legitimate policing. So if we were to also score legitimacy for these same features, we would end up double counting. And this becomes important when I show you the weightings that we suggest on the next slide. So third, we're isolating a legitimacy remainder, as we're calling it. So even if the sort of NJAB principles are done well, there can still be additional instrumental and democratic reasons that fall under this legitimacy remainder. Those instrumental reasons are going to be about cooperation and trust. So when people believe that the police are legitimate, they see them being legitimate, then they trust the police more and are more likely to cooperate, which, overall serves things well. But there's also a democratic value, which is the democratic value of having citizens shape policing, which is carried out with their consent. We have this idea of policing by consent. And so it seems like there are additional distinct ethical reasons that are generated by this that give us the effect that these the public perception of what the police are doing matters in its own right, because the police are acting in their name. So this is now the kind of core of our proposal. What we've got here is a hierarchy where we argue that the principles have a kind of default order of weight, but that there's a range. So depending on the circumstances, these considerations will kind of weigh or pull to a greater or lesser extent, but that the kind of maximum ranges are different for the different principles. So why this ordering? Well, we start with non-maleficence because in policing, the most urgent moral task is preventing immediate specific threats to life and bodily security. The right to life is fundamental, and the police are routinely called into situations where there's a concrete risk of serious injury or death. So we specify non-maleficence in the policing context to capture a very stringent duty to minimize and not cause near-term specific harm to victims, bystanders, suspects, and so on. And we give it a range of -5 to +5 to capture the harms, sometimes very serious harms, grave harms, caused or prevented by action. And then second is justice. It comes next because, well, police is part of the criminal justice system. Justice is a key goal. But remember, justice isn't only about criminal justice, it's also about procedural fairness. And this is absolutely central, critical for legitimacy. But securing justice, for example, pursuing, a conviction is not going to be at any cost. So this is why it's second. But the harms that come from or potential harms that come from action are weighed just a little bit more heavily, we think, in this model. So then next is autonomy, which is about rights and rights interferences and the costs of those in policing. Even when coercive power is justified, rights don't drop out. They don't become morally neutral just because the police can search people, can ask for information, and so on. So this shapes the limits and conditions under which police coercion can be exercised. And so here we're saying that although rights can be interfered with to some extent, that doesn't make them morally neutral, but they are more important than a probabilistic, so this is moving to the next principle, kind of security, broader, more diffuse security gains, because rights are obviously important. And just to note that we've got a small kind of positive +1 possibility for autonomy where um, in some situations doing something might be sort of in autonomy supporting or enhancing, particularly perhaps for a victim, where we would want to take this into account beyond just not infringing their rights. So beneficence is fourth, and the gloss we're giving this here is about broader public security or public interest. Um, this is where we locate the more diffuse, longer horizon goods, such as crime prevention and broader welfare gains. So this is not about immediate threat management. This is about preventing crime in the future. And it's given a bit of a lower weight, partly guarding against paternalism and mission creep, but it's also because these broader gains are often more uncertain and harder to attribute. And it's hard to justify, for example, definitive coercive costs to rights interferences that fall under autonomy on the basis of speculative future benefits. So that is why beneficence sits lower. And finally, we've got the legitimacy remainder, which we've scored from -2 to +1. The reason for this asymmetry is that the public concern or criticism or dissent to police activity and intervention should be more of a brake on what the police are doing, and not so much as sort of uh, not so much have a sort of positive. We think the police should be doing this. So it's more that legitimacy, insofar it is as it's about the public approval of what the police are doing, will act more as a brake, but we don't give it. Except in very exceptional cases, a very the largest weight, because we wouldn't want policing to just become a kind of public vote. Essentially, it's relevant, but it's not. We would want to avoid sort of just carte blanche for public approval. There would be some exceptional cases, which I don't have time to go into, where we think that legitimacy might actually might weigh more heavily, particularly in communities where perhaps they have been over-policed in the past, and the legitimacy is really public trust is really, really critical. So there might be some cases where that might extend. But this gives you basically our kind of outline of the rough weights that we think these principles have in relation to each other, and how they can stretch depending on the facts of a particular situation. So, autonomy is going to be stretched more and more negatively the bigger the rights intrusion. A small kind of freedom of movement interference is going to be, maybe a -1, but something that is really intrusive is going to stretch further and further. So, how do you actually use this? Well, to make it usable, we've sort of thought of a staged procedure. So first, you would apply the legitimacy gate. Is a proposed exercise of police power within bounded rightful authority? If it fails, then you stop. If it passes, then you specify what non-maleficence, justice, autonomy, beneficence amount to in the particular context. Score those domains using the calibrated range, and after that, the legitimacy remainder, and then balance and justify and document the reasoning. And it will produce, we suggest, a sort of indicative score that would not be decisive, but might give you an indication if it's, positive or negative of where the sort of ethical balance is leaning. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I'm just checking. I'm running out of time. So I'll give you the impression of how we would go about using this. In our paper, we've got a couple of scenarios where we go through and, as you can see on this slide, this sort of shows our working really in detail, score the different considerations and come up with a rationale based on this for whether the proposed action would be supported ethically or not. And again, this is just supposed to be an indication of kind of ethical leaning. So I don't have time to go into these, but as you can see, the way that we would apply this would involve, even within consideration, kind of trading off, and a lot of detail would go into the decision making. So just to finish up then, we what are we adding? So firstly, we hope that we're adding clearer concepts. One reason people talk past each other in policing debates is that the same term like harm or fairness is used differently and is sometimes doing multiple jobs. Second, better documentation of trade-offs, outweighed what and why. Third, legitimacy is made explicit, but also constrained, so it can't become either a kind of popularity contest or a trump card. And fourth, the staged method could be, used for training and supervision, and it provides a kind of justification that can be audited. But it's also important to say what we're not claiming. So this is not an ethical calculator. It can't fix empirical uncertainty, and it will not remove and should not remove reasonable disagreement. So the numbers are there so that disagreement is made visible and revisible, but not hidden. So I'll finish there because I'm out of time. But thank you very much and looking forward to your questions.
Thanks, Hannah. Wonderful stuff. Now we'll pass on to Matthew. Matthew.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I'm quite honoured actually to be invited, and I'm very happy to see that so many people have tuned in to listen. In some ways, what I speak about today will be a bit of a continuation, or at least on the same loose theme as what Hannah was discussing. Possibly the main real difference is that while she was really looking at how principles that are applied in, say, biomedical ethics can be transitioned into policing, I'm sort of more looking at whether the broad goals of policing and medicine, the broad sort of ethical goals, are the same, at least to some extent. So really, there are two parts to what I'm going to be discussing, two issues to look at. Firstly, whether policing and healthcare are simply different fields with different ethical imperatives, or whether they actually work towards some of or all of the same ethical goals. And secondly, if they do work towards the same goals, whether a common metric can be developed to help compare the benefit received from, for example, receiving a medical intervention to that received from receiving a policing intervention. If so, then I think that there are some implications for the ethical distribution of resource, among other questions. But one of the first things that struck me when I started to consider the connection between the two professions is that even within each profession, there is a lot of disagreement on what the scope of the profession actually is. And in large part, this is influenced by whether these professions are defined by what they aim to achieve or by the things that they actually do. And I hope to sort of expand on that now. So on the screen at the moment, there are a number of pretty emblematic images depicting healthcare, which show the variety of tasks that healthcare providers may be required to provide. And I've got a quote up on the screen now that says that, from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, that Australia's health system is a complex mix of service providers and other health professionals. And we all know that healthcare professionals perform surgery, they do general checkups and blood tests, conduct biopsies, etc. Recommend pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical interventions. They offer advice. And in doing so, they use many tools that are available to their profession. Simple things even like stethoscopes and scalpels and thermometers and syringes, as well as, and possibly especially, the knowledge and skills of the individual practitioner. Now compare this with policing. So on the screen we have another a very different series of emblematic images. You know, an emergency situation in one, a crime scene, it appears in another, an image of two police officers patrolling. And a quote now from the Australian Bureau of Statistics role description of a general duties police officer. So it says that the role of such an officer is maintains public order, protects life and property, prevents antisocial behaviour, and enforces laws by patrolling public areas, responding to reports of damage, and arresting suspected offenders. But the thing that's noteworthy here to me is what I've now highlighted. It very much defines, while it does talk about the goals of the profession, maintaining public order and protecting life, etc., it really emphasizes the way in which these things are done. It places a lot of emphasis on the method or the tools used to achieve the goals. So yes, while police do aim to protect life, they do it in a certain way by responding to reports, by patrolling, and by executing arrests. And so in this way, the role of a general duties police officer is defined very much in terms of the means it applies as well as the ends that it hopes to achieve. And we all know that the different techniques that police may use, just like medical practitioners might use scalpels or syringes, police may use handcuffs and batons and patrol cars. But I now want to look at a very different set of images. So at first glance, these images do not in any way depict policing or healthcare. But they are also not, I suggest, irrelevant to them. After all, they all depict people who are in apparently good health, in apparently safe and secure environments. And this leads me to the observation that while images of police in action and images of medical practitioners in action all look very different, once we transition to images that depict the outcome of successful policing and the outcome of successful healthcare, then they all start to look strikingly similar. And consider a couple more quotes. The first one is one of the well-known Peelian principles. The Peelian principles are pretty much regarded as foundation principles for modern legitimate policing. And this one emphasizes that the test of police efficiency is the absence of crime and disorder, not the visible evidence of police action in dealing with them. And the next one, from the World Health Organization's constitution, health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And now I've just highlighted a few points there. So we're looking at complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and obviously the absence of crime and disorder. And I suggest that together, these quotes emphasize different elements of healthcare and policing, elements that prioritize outcomes over obvious treatment, and also what we might call flourishing over mere survival. And for good measure, I'll add one more quote up there from the World Health Organization's constitution, which is the health of all peoples is fundamental to the attainment of peace and security. When we start looking at it in this way, it's starting to sound very much like healthcare and policing share at least some of the same goals. In fact, while some accounts of health and policing are very insular in focus, as we've seen, others accounts are much broader. So, for example, a few more quotes for you. One of them on the left discusses what's called problem-oriented policing. And while the one on the right is somewhat dated now, but it's an observation from the National Health and Medical Research Council. So problem-oriented policing, as the quote shows, emphasizes identifying the underlying conditions that cause community problems and developing preventative responses that expand well beyond the normal scope of the criminal justice system. And likewise, the second quote highlights how the likes of education and housing often have more impact on health than formal healthcare does. Extrapolating from this, we might even conclude that healthcare goals can often be achieved by non-healthcare means. However, I do want to re-emphasize the point I made earlier about the professions not being settled in their own goals. And so while there certainly has been a move, I think, towards identifying underlying problems and interagency collaboration beyond merely using the tools of one's own profession, in recent times, there's also been growing calls, I suppose almost a counter movement in the case of policing, for police to stay in their own lane and return to what are considered to be their core responsibilities. Sometimes you call this as back to basics, or the idea that policing has been involved in some form of mission creep over the years. But essentially, I want to leave this part of the discussion by reiterating 2 points. One, that while the goals of each profession are not settled, 2, it is at least credible that they share some common aims. And so, okay, so far I've been highlighting how, depending on how we look at them, healthcare and policing may be working towards the same ends. For example, they both seem to have the same goal of preserving life and promoting secure lives that are replete with well-being and flourishing. But I want to look more explicitly now at the ethical issues. So as you may know, as I'm assuming most of you are familiar with, normative ethics is the field that examines questions such as what things are good and bad and what actions are right and wrong. This is the domain, I suppose, of approaches like consequentialism and deontology and virtue ethics, those sorts of debates. Whether certain things are right and wrong in and of themselves, or whether they are right as a result of the consequences that they produce, for example. Practical ethics or applied ethics, in contrast, examines more specific ethical issues, while professional ethics examines the ethical issues that arise in particular professions, including policing and healthcare. So Hannah has spoken, for example, about the prominence of principalism in healthcare and how the modified approach and Jeb Plassell has significant potential in policing. But now I want to look at 2 measures used in the professions. Quality adjusted life years, or QALYs, which have been used in healthcare for some decades, and crime harm indexes, which are a more recent development in policing. So I've got a table, which I'll explain in a moment, but just as a brief summary, quality adjusted life years essentially are tools that enable healthcare interventions and policies to be evaluated by a measure that factors in both length of life and quality of life. It follows the intuition had by many people that some years of life are simply better than others, and that while an extra year in middling health may be preferable to an early death, it's not necessarily as valuable as a year in full health. In a sense, QALYs change the focus from maximizing the length of a life to maximizing life adjusted for quality. Crime harm indexes, in contrast, were inspired by the realization that crimes vary in harmfulness. Some are very serious, some are very minor. Typically, these indexes score crimes based on the median sentence received by first-time offenders responsible for a given category of crime. Because murderers receive X times longer sentences than pickpockets, murder is X times more harmful. And by creating this common metric within policing or within crime, they hope to evaluate policing interventions based on their impact on crime harm, just as healthcare professionals may evaluate interventions based on their impact on QALYs. But let's just spend a moment just having a quick look at the table and what I think that these 2 approaches, despite all their differences, and they are many, but what I think they have in common. So the first one is they both look for a common metric within their own fields. So in the case of QALYs, a life may be scored from 0 to 1, with 1 being a life of full health, and perhaps with minus scores if someone felt that a certain life was worse than death. And they tend to be measured in years, Crime harm indexes, in contrast, weight all crimes according to harmfulness and tend to be measured in days. They both have an implied or explicit imperative involved, and either explicitly or implied, they both seem to be influenced by utilitarianism. In the case of quality adjusted life years, the goal being to maximize QALYs. For a single patient or across the system, in the case of crime harm indexes, to reduce the most crime harm. Now, I've put in there that this might be bounded because even though we do try to maximize these things, other factors also put guardrails against what we can do. So, for example, in healthcare, it's looking after patient autonomy. So autonomy counts for something, even if it's perhaps produces a less than ideal result in terms of QALYs. And in the case of policing, we want to reduce crime harm, but we still need to act legitimately, for example. Both are measurable, so they can be, so in the case of QALYs, they can be evaluated post-intervention to see what result was actually achieved compared to what was expected. And in the case of crime harm indexes, year-on-year reduction in total crime harm or year-on-year increases can be considered. But they also both have limitations. So fairness is sometimes raised in the case of QALYs, perhaps a bias in favor of the young versus the elderly. And crime harm indexes, I think, also are quite limited in the sense that they overlook many non-utility factors, very much the kinds of considerations that Hannah was talking about. They also really only look at half of utility, where we'd normally think of pleasure and pain or benefit and harm. They look at harm, but they don't really explore how we can measure broader benefits to society from policing. So what next? I am very conscious here that I've given a lightning speed description of two very complex ideas, but hopefully I've been clear enough to provide an understanding of where these two ideas might lead us. So let's give it a go. The first thing I want to note is that it should be clear that QALYs and crime harm indexes measure very different things. But the simple fact that they quantify, measure, and compare, to me, opens up the possibility that policing and healthcare initiatives might be able to exist on the same scale. So rather than just having a QALY scale here and a QALY evaluation and a crime harm scale here and a crime harm evaluation, somehow we might be able to merge these onto one scale. This would require considerable work, I think, and I would liken it to the work that would have to go into creating, say, a currency converter to, for example, convert Australian dollars into pound sterling, or a dictionary converting English into Arabic. English and Arabic, for example, use very different symbols and they use different sounds, but translation is possible. And I do note that crime harm indexes have already converted different things onto the one scale anyway. So they've used techniques for work. It was not all. I mentioned earlier that crime harm indexes are scored in terms of days. Harm is determined in terms of days, in terms of median sentence. But not every sentence received is a prison sentence. Sometimes people are given a fine. But they can be adjusted onto the one scale by, for example, working out how many days at the minimum wage is required to earn the amount of money to pay for a particular fine. So if for example, it took 3 days at the minimum wage to pay for a fine, then that may be equivalent to 3 days in prison. But I do believe, despite any limitations, it's viable in principle. And some policing examples and initiatives, for example, may be scoreable in terms of QALYs. I mentioned here the impact on road safety, deaths, serious injuries, prevention of serious assaults. So deaths and injuries from motor vehicle collisions have legal as well as healthcare impacts, as do serious assaults. At its simplest, these examples could constitute effectively a Rosetta Stone that links QALYs and crime harm. So for example, this is a very simplistic way that it could work. Once you know the crime harm score given to a collision that caused a serious injury, that crime harm score being based on the median sentence received by first-time offenders, and you also know the impact that same collision had on the injured person's quality adjusted life years, then you may have the key needed to relatively weight very different things, such as cancer treatment and burglary. Once you know where 2 points line up, you can then bring the rest in. If you know, for example, how the same incident scores on 2 different scales, then you can use this to give a relative weight to items that appear only on different scales. Some things appear on both, most don't, but you can use this as a way, I suggest, of translating the remainder into something usable. But I also think that what I've just said is probably far too simplistic. And in all likelihood, much more work is going to be required. Personally, I think that a lot more work needs to be done with crime harm indexes. And also, I know that there's a lot of debate over the utility of QALYs. So more work is needed on each of those, and certainly more work is needed if we are going to try to bring these ideas in. And really, I use this just as an example to show proof of concept, rather than to say that this is the way I actually envisage it operating. So this leads me to some tentative conclusions, and I really put an emphasis on the tentative. So this being that healthcare goods and policing goods may be we know they can be operationalized, and they may be operationalizable and placeable on the same scale. If so, then I think this may assist with issues such as ethical resource allocation. Regardless, instead of just a healthcare practitioner and a policing expert trying to work out how to use policing and healthcare resources, higher level government, for example, can then use it to make decisions about whether to prioritize a particular healthcare initiative over a policing initiative or vice versa. But I do stress the sketch provided is not in any way a complete ethical account. It probably works best for beneficence and non-maleficence, so harm and benefit. It certainly does not factor in justice or autonomy, but I'm at least open to the idea that perhaps these concepts can be operationalizable in their own way and measured. But that being the case, thank you all very much for listening. And as with Hannah, I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have.
Wonderful. Thank you both for coming to speak to us today. It's Helen's seminar. Yeah, and everyone else here, just thank our speakers. And the next Helen seminar, I think, is it's sort of mid-April, so we miss the Easter holiday. So I hope to see a lot of you back then. And yeah, thank you again, Matthew and Hannah.
Thanks.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right, see you all.
Bye.
Goodbye.